going to go ahead and start talking about this because I don't know what your experiences were like of reading this chapter 11, I believe it is, but it took me on a wild ride, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But it's called Yahweh's Frustrating Freedom, and I found myself frustrated by Brueggemann's ponderings about the freedom because I just seemed unclear as to what he was trying to say. But as I continued to engage the chapter, and I read it and then I reread it, I began to, I think, get a clear idea of what it was he was talking about. And then it started to fire up my scholar imagination and also my interest in theology and all of the things related to God, because the concept talked about here is really intriguing, because especially as we begin to talk about the glory of God and what that means in the biblical text and in the world that Exodus chapter 33 lives in. I don't think we think that way about God so much anymore. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. More on that in a little bit. I should just rewind it all and go back to the beginning. So today we're going over chapter 11 of Delivered into Covenant, Yahweh's Frustrating Freedom. And it is selected as the pivotal text, chapter 33, verse 19, which reads, "The Lord said, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy." I immediately saw a parallel between that line and what Jesus says in the parable about God raining on the just and the unjust, or not a parable, but an aphorism that he uses. Same basic idea. God blesses those that God blesses, and we really don't understand all the time why that is. Why this person and not that person, and why certain circumstances. And this chapter continues to reflect on the dialogue between Moses and Yahweh after the golden calf. And if you recall in last week's chapter, compelling God to change, it was emphasized how Moses was able to persuade Yahweh to refrain from destroying the Israelites for their idolatry. And the point was that God can be reasoned with, even argued with, and that these conversations, or began to talk about them as prayers, can influence God towards certain positive action, or may persuade God to refrain from action, as was the case in chapter 32, as Moses was trying to talk Yahweh out of destroying the people. In some, Yahweh was persuaded toward an act of grace and mercy. In this chapter, the dialogue continues, and I've come to see that this chapter, along with next week's chapter 12, are companion chapters. And so my intuition last week was correct that these chapters are flowing one into the other and complement one another, which I do appreciate. In chapter 33, after in the wake of last week's chapter, Moses will try to plumb the depths of God's mystery and discern if Yahweh can reliably be trusted to continue to extend the grace and mercy to the people. And God's answer is yes, but it's also ambiguous. Brueggemann spends much of his time in this chapter poring over the dialogue in Exodus chapter 33 with a fine-tooth comb. And I'm not going to do that here, and I cut to the chase. That was part of what I think lost me in this chapter, was the first half really got lost in the weeds, in my opinion. So I was left thinking, what is he driving at? It took me a while to find his focus, but here's the gist of the chapter as outlined by me. One, Moses is asked to move along with the people, but the Lord has decided not to go with the people into the promised land. Yes, Yahweh consumed them in anger. As I read over this part, I was left with this idea that Yahweh's like, I'm going to honor the promise that I made to your ancestors for land, and the promise I made to you for land. But I'm so mad. If I go with you, I'm afraid I'm just going to destroy you again, or in this text, consume them. And so Yahweh was wanting to stay back. And so Moses' objective at this point becomes to convince Yahweh to go with the people. And he uses different reasons and arguments for that. And the people, number 2.2, are also distraught upon hearing that Yahweh will not go with them. Upon observing their distress, Yahweh then makes a concession. Yahweh will go with them to the promised land, but only if they remove the ornaments from their bodies that they have obtained in Egypt, jewelry and the like. And it's described next how Moses meets with Yahweh intimately in the tent outside the camp for conversations, face to face, as one speaks with a friend, as the text reads. And he's interceding, point 4, on behalf of the people in an attempt to convince Yahweh to accompany the people into the promised land. Moses finds favor with Yahweh, and so on Moses' behalf, not because of any virtue in the people, Yahweh concedes and decides to travel with the people. 5th point, Moses, possibly emboldened by his successful petition, and remember all that he's been through. And last week we talked about how brave of an act it would have been to confront an angry God in the way that he did. And so anyway, Moses, emboldened by the successful petition, asked to see God's glory. So he's gotten the first thing he's asked for. Yahweh's going to go with the people. And now he asks to see God's glory. And this is where things got really interesting to me as I began to try to get my mind around what was meant by this, God's glory. Again, more on that in a moment. But in the meantime, God agrees to make God's goodness pass before him. But Moses will only catch a glimpse of God's glory, the backside of God's glory, to be precise. God will cover Moses' face with God's hand until the final moment. Then Moses will see the tail end of God's glory. For to look upon Yahweh directly, Yahweh's face would overwhelm and kill Moses, is what we read. And then this is what happens. Not that Moses is killed, but that God, you will read in chapter 34, passes before Moses, covers his face, and Moses beholds Yahweh. Lastly, the conversation between Yahweh and Moses continues into chapter 34. We'll talk more about that next week. That's when Moses returns to camp, his face shining because of his exposure to the backside of God's glory. And I take a moment to pause here to note, I was now realizing that I did not change any of the pictures for this presentation. These are last week's pictures that we're looking at here. So I apologize for missing that detail. In the amidst preparing, I just failed to do that. So the pictures that you're seeing along with this lesson do not necessarily correspond with what I'm saying. Apologies. But we'll go on. There's the outline. And what to make of all of this? First, what is God's glory? Just what is Moses asking God to reveal? Here's the definition of glory as described by Brueggemann. Quoting him from page 122 of the ebook, glory constitutes the goodness of God, an inscrutability that must remain hidden and inaccessible, that cannot and must not be penetrated. And if you're confused, join the club. Upon my initial reading, I was very confused. But as I continued to read and then reread this chapter, I began to form some idea of what Brueggemann was driving at. And that's where I began to get excited. And I'll take you on that journey now. Basically, God's glory is the reservoir, as I am coming to understand it, is the reservoir of God's goodness, life, light, energy, love, creativity, infinity, and of his infinite, indescribable, positive attributes. So it's all that God is in God's self, with or without creation. This is God's essential nature. And it's from this wellspring that God draws all power, inspiration, and action. So Moses wants to see more of God's glory than he has seen heretofore. And he's already seen quite a lot. I mean, he's been with Yahweh has been with the people through Egypt, and Moses has seen quite a lot of God's glory revealed by way of the acts and manifestations of God, but he wants to see more. If you're still confused, perhaps the following analogy will help you. This is my own analogy. I think that it works. Imagine that you have observed a work of art so astonishing in its beauty that you become intensely curious about its originator. Your question, from what mind or being did this astonishing work come from? I'd like to know more about that mind's intimate workings. I'd like to know what more glory like this work of art might generate in that mind. In short, you'd like to behold the artist's glory in all of their splendor. What is the glory of Mozart or Van Gogh? And we plumb the depths of these lives only to scratch the surface. I went to see the Van Gogh exhibit before it left the Newfields, the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And I don't know if you got to see that, this immersive art experience, but it seemed to be trying to get at the man, the person, the being who was the originator of all of the lovely things we were seeing in that room and in that space. And it's as if we were trying to see the glory of the artist. Where did this come from? Where is the wellspring of creative energy that this came from? And that exhibit in the museum seemed to be trying to understand better the glory, quote unquote, of an artist like Van Gogh. And one of the things that was pretty obvious to people there, and I think the presentation even made this point, there really is a lot of that mind, that artist in Van Gogh, that is inaccessible, that we'll never know, that we can't scratch at, that we can only guess at, that is inscrutable and unreachable. And if that's true of an artist, a human, how much more so when it comes to God? And that's kind of the idea that is the rest of this interaction is playing around. How much of God's glory, God's essential self, from which all of the beauty in the world came from. All of it is reflective of this glory. Everything, you, me, made in the image of God, the trees, everything is reflections of this glory, but it's not it's shadow of the real, it's not God's straight with no chaser. It's just, you can learn something of the person that made, a work of art, or something about God from looking at creation, but you can't know everything. And everything that follows in the story seems to be about how much of God's glory can Moses, the prophet and servant of God, behold. Now, I said that Moses has observed quite a lot of God's glory as manifest through the work of God, the liberating work of God that we've been reading about in Exodus. And the work of God that Moses is so enamored with here in this specific moment is the mercy and grace that God has shown the faithless people. That's what has Moses impressed. And here God reveals the glory as the grace and mercy that Yahweh has shown. Those are outpourings of God's glory. So just as Starry Night is an outpouring of Van Gogh's glory, so too is God's mercy an outpouring of God's glory. Moses is curious about the source. He has caught a glimpse of God's glory by way of God's mercy, and he has been emboldened because the glory he's glimpsed was only prompted by his persistence in dialogue. That was last week's lesson. Boldly and bravely interceding on behalf of the people, imploring God to show them mercy. It's as if Moses wants to know just how much grace and mercy God has stored up for Israel in some. Perhaps then the people can sojourn onward with more confidence, knowing that God's grace and mercy for them is an ample supply. It is when Moses asks for a fuller revelation of God's glory in this sense that Yahweh responds with today's pivotal verse. The Lord said, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. It's as if God is saying, I'm not going to show you all of my cards, but not because God is being arbitrarily stingy. As we conclude with this lesson, we will learn upon reflecting on the text that it's because Moses simply cannot take it all in. As we'll read later, or consider later, as is in the text, he can't look on the face of God and live. That's the problem. This is too much glory to even take in for our finite minds. We don't have the hardware to take it in. Maybe another analogy I'm just thinking of in the moment would be as if you tried to upload a very, very complex software onto an old, antiquated computer. The computer could not handle it. Same with us, trying to comprehend the mysteries of God and the deep things that are beyond our mind's comprehension. That Moses is trying to discover just how close to the glory, the mystery he can get with, and to come away blessed by it. Of this statement, that God will show mercy on who God will show mercy, Brueggemann writes, this double statement is an assertion that God's utter freedom in the enactment of grace and mercy, that God will not be compelled to act in this way or that way. God will not be predicted or coerced on God's way. God's glory, which includes outpourings of grace and mercy, cannot be controlled, channeled, or exploited. God's glory will not be confined to or be at the mercy of the whims and welfare of any people. God's mercy is for God to give, and we will never form a fully reasoned rationale or understanding regarding the ways of God. A fuller quote from the chapter should make the point. Quote, on one hand, the usage is likely a reprimand to Moses, the usage of this pivotal verse that God will show mercy on who God will show mercy. Seems like a reprimand. Shame on you, Moses, for asking. Who wants to know too much and wants to be assured that divine grace and mercy will be on exhibit for him and for Israel. Against such crowding and attempt at preemption, Yahweh asserts that grace and mercy are fully beyond subjection to Moses' expectation. On the other hand, the freedom of Yahweh might be an assurance to Moses, for it suggests that divine grace and mercy are not to be earned. Israel need not qualify for such a divine gesture. The assurance might be that Moses need not worry that Israel is unworthy of divine grace and mercy because it is totally free. It is the totally free gift of God. The statement is enigmatic. Neither the reprimand nor the assurance is absolute because God keeps open for God alone all the options. Thus, any future that Moses might want for Israel depends completely on the inclination of Yahweh, who is capable of grace and mercy, even to covenant violators. The holy freedom of Yahweh opens the way for Israel. It must also have left Moses frustrated because he could not finally know and be sure of that mercy and grace for Israel in time to come. That frustration continues and is resolved only in the next chapter. Chapter 33 concludes with one of the more memorable images in the Bible. Yahweh describes to Moses the measured and fleeting way they will pass before Moses. When Yahweh passes by, God will shield Moses' face with Yahweh's own hand. In the last moment, Moses' face will be uncovered, and only then can Moses lay eyes on Yahweh. But he will only be permitted to catch a glimpse of God's back. It's as if to say, I'll let you see as much as you can take. A less filtered revelation of God's glory will undo you. In fact, we are told that no one shall see God and live. Apparently, the unvarnished truth, the deep mysteries of God, is too much for us to take. We constitutionally cannot receive it, but God gives us what we can take. How much more will God reveal of God's glory? We will not, cannot know, which may be the entire point of today's chapter. So that brings us to the conclusion, and I suspect, I'm hoping for a good discussion about it as well. I would just say before we move on that the next class will be on Thursday, September the 15th. The following week, September the 22nd, I will be at a retreat. I will be working remotely. I will be in Southern Indianapolis. I will not be in the office on the next Thursday, the 22nd. So we will have the concluding, and that is, you heard me right, the concluding lesson on this book and this series, these two books, the series of books on the 29th of September. So that might make you sad. That might make you happy. Either way, we will be done with this book within the next 3 weeks. And then we will focus on what we'll do into the season of Advent as a devotional, probably some sort of Advent devotion. But in the meantime, I will bring us back and ask that you unmute and questions, comments, observations. This one was a doozy, I have to say. I thought it was. So I'm curious what you think, what you noticed, or were frustrated by. All of the above.
For me, this was the one I got the most out of so far.
Good.
I mean, there's been times I've just shook my head. What is this man saying?
I know.
But today I did have a couple of things that spoke to me and everything. And this week I'm reading from Ezekiel chapter 20, and I could not believe it. It's as if God is up on them, because this is Ezekiel, and the people have come to him and they're wanting to talk to God. And God says they did not follow my statutes. They despised my law for well living and obedient in the ways that I have set out. They totally desecrated my holy Sabbath. I seriously considered unleashing my anger on them right there in the desert, but I thought better of it and acted out of who I was, not of what I felt, so that I might be honored and not blasphemed by the nations who have seen me bring them out. I did not lift my hand in it. I did lift my hand in a solemn oath there in the desert and promised them that I would not bring them into the country flowing with milk and honey. And I had chosen for them that jewel among the lands. And then down a little bit later, he says, I did not lift my hand. I did lift my hand in solemn promise there in the desert and swore that I would scatter them all over the world, disperse them every which way, because they did not keep my laws and live by my statutes. And I thought, wow, I'm getting Exodus two different ways here.
You are.
Yeah, it was good.
What you just read from Ezekiel.
Yeah.
It's foreshadowing of I was following along with you.
Okay.
And that foreshadows where we're going next week.
Okay.
because it's again, this is if this the next two this chapter and next week's chapter really need to be read together. I can't wait to get to it, because next week is about what is the essential, unchanging nature of God, and how does that direct God's actions in the world ultimately. So God might get mad and be super mad, but there is this internal integrity to God that pulls God to mercy and a steadfast love time and time again. And this is what back to this week's chapter, this is what Moses has noticed and is thinking, I want to see more about that. I've seen God's glory. I've seen God's glory manifest through plagues in Egypt. I've seen God's glory manifest through the ways that Pharaoh was made a fool and the Red Sea and all that. Now I've seen God's glory in this way, and I'm wanting to know how much is there. And God is like, that's for me to know and you to find out.
Yeah.
And
there are not enough words to describe our God.
And in the context of mercy and grace, the implications are the first thing, and this was reflected in the quote I read. Well, you might think to yourself, well, it might run out and then I'm done for. But in the context of the Israelites, what they discovered was there was a lot more there than they ever could have considered that they deserved. So maybe there is more than anybody could have dreamed of. And God is like, it's for me to know and for you to find out. Mm-hmm. And I just had never thought about glory like as a substance almost. It's being talked about almost like a substance or some sort of essence that isn't like matter or isn't like, gas.
Something that radiates.
Yeah, radiate.
I think it's something that's radiating.
And here we're trying to find. My mind goes to those sorts of images too, and I think it just really comes down to having not enough words or brains that can't.
Yeah. I think for me, part of the problem is we talk about God on the throne. Okay. And when we think of throne, we think human body. Mm-hmm. We think, or some kind of a body of some kind. But I believe in my own reality, in my way of thinking about God, that he doesn't sit on a throne. God.
It's a metaphor.
Maybe part of God sits on the throne, but
I think it's a metaphor.
Yeah. God is everywhere. So looking up into the heavens, you can see his glory. And
the earth isn't literally a footstool. Yeah,
right. So yeah, it's his glory.
I'm so glad that this chapter spoke to you, Sue, because I was worried when I first read it, not about you in specific, but just about all of us. Because I was reading it, and I would say the first 3 pages, I was getting angry. I was like, "Oh, great, we're in for another one of those." But then, once I began to think that I was getting the point, I got this idea actually invigorated me. So, yeah.
And I think too, there have been individuals that I have known, and the way that they live their life and the things that they do, that there I have seen God's glory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that, he works through some individuals and helps us understand more of who he is. And the fact that Moses could only see his back, we can't comprehend God in this state. When we get to be our heavenly state, that will be different. But in this state, there's no way in our little human mind that we can possibly.
It's that time you're free now.
Understand. So seeing only the back of God is a good thing.
I made an appointment.
And it left Moses glowing like a light bulb, and it covered him up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
Well, Nancy, I noticed you unmuted for a moment. Did you have a thought or a comment?
yeah, I was just going to ask this is about seeing the backside.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand that.
I use the word backside facetiously because the author also did. I did not look deeply. I did not look at all into like if the language indicates God's posterior versus it's anthropomorphic. First off, back to your comment, Sue. God doesn't have a butt, you know. But is that meant to be like tongue-in-cheek playful, like God being playful? You know, it's like you can just catch a glimpse, you know, as I'm I don't know. I just had Marilyn Monroe come. I'm sorry. I just had her pop in my head of that famous scene, you know, like where that scene where she's sorry, but that's what popped in my head. Like, is it playful like that? You know, that's complicated because but is it, you get the gist I'm talking about. I hope that is it a sort of, I don't know, a wink at us, or is it just very literal, just, you know, watching God walk away. That's it. No joke or intended pun or whatever. I don't know. Was that the gist of your question though? Wondering if there's more to that. Then I don't know. I'm sorry to say, I don't know. You're muted though. If you're,
Yeah. I mean, I just didn't get that whole concept. So
the significance of the concept is that you can't, if Moses looks at God in the face, God, it's overwhelming. Moses will die. So God is giving Moses exactly the most he can take of beholding God's glory. That's the idea.
okay.
I think that's true for us too. You know, like I was saying, when you look up the skies and you see all the stars, it's like a glory of God there. That's part of God that we can understand.
Mm-hmm.
Or when you watch a plant bursting through the ground, that's something we can understand as a human, that the work, the thought, I guess, that had to go into it to create it. And when you think about your hand and you really can't see them, but there's cells there, and inside the cells are other little things running around. And we don't usually think when we look at our hand, oh, there's cells. And then there are other things. I can't see them. It's the wonder of God. It's, this is all we can comprehend.
I love that light is also a metaphor for God, and how light, that we've discovered, is both a particle and a wave. It behaves like both. And so if you try to observe it as particle, you observe it that way. If you try to observe it as wave, but it seems a contradiction itself. We don't understand light. Basically, we don't understand light. It behaves both ways. And if light standing as a metaphor for God, it's a beautiful picture of this beautiful and radiant presence that's all around us. We take it for granted. We sometimes don't notice that the light's on or off. And yet it's so complex that we can't even get our mind around what the light is that illuminates us. And anyway, here's where we wrap it up.
Yeah, when not Moses, when Jesus was on the mount, he lit up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when Elijah and Moses came to him and everything, as
It's
white
meant
as
to brought us.
snow.
Our minds are meant to connect to this story when we see those, another encounter on the mountain where the prophet goes up and is illumined.
Yeah.
Well, Connie, you've been quiet. Do you have anything you want to add to the discussion?
No, I'm taking it all in. I'll be honest, I was not caught up. So this is all relatively new, but I was listening to what Sue was saying about looking up and seeing the stars and the magnificence of that. And yet there's so much more beyond the stars that we don't know, and we're still finding out what's beyond what we supposedly can see, and how much more then is beyond that they're finding out about. I mean, it's a continuation. And I get my head wrapped around the fact that you can only know so much, or we as humans can only know so much without it just kind of turning into a mind explosion.
Well, thank you for coming, and for those of you who may watch this later, some future hypothetical future. Thank you for tuning in as well. I'll see some of you this weekend, and then you, Nancy, I'll probably see next week through the Leadership Council meeting. And until next time, thank you for this. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
I